Yeah, I see it's live.
Great. I'll go ahead and get started then. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second day of 2021 Music King Conference. Our panel today is Rediscovering the Works of Antonio Vandini with presenters Marc Vanscheeuwijck and Elinor Frey. Marc Vanscheeuwijck today is Rediscovering the Works of Antonio. Let me close my own browsers. Okay. Marc Vanscheeuwijck is a Belgian Baroque cellist and a professor of musicology at the University of Oregon, where from 2007 to 2019, he was chair of the musicology, ethnomusicology, and historical performance practice area. He teaches music history courses in the Renaissance, Baroque, and classical periods, performance practice, Baroque cello, musical iconography, and music and rhetoric. And he co-directs the Collegium Musicum Ensemble, which specializes in early music. His research focuses on late 17th century music in Bologna and on the history and repertoire of cellos and bass violins. He has written several articles for Performance Practice Review, Early Music, and elsewhere, and he's published various critical facsimiles of Bolognese 17th century cello music. His first book, titled The Cappella Musicale of San Petronio in Bologna under Giovanni Paolo Colonna, 1674 to 1695, History, Organization, Repertoire, was published in 2003 by the Belgian Historical Institute in Rome. Recently, he co-edited a volume of studies on Corelli titled Arcomello 2013, and a book with 5 CDs titled Cello Stories, The Cello in the 17th and 18th Centuries. He also edited a recently published book, I Bononcini da Modena all'Europa, 1666 to 1747. As a Baroque cellist, he regularly performs with ensembles in Belgium, Italy, Germany, the Czech Republic, and the USA. And he teaches seminars and master classes on historical performance practices in universities and conservatories throughout Europe. Elinor Frey is a leading Canadian-American cellist and researcher who specializes in early music and new music. She has a number of acclaimed CDs with the Belgian label Passacaia. Her 2020 CD, Giuseppe Clementi dell'Abaco, Cello Sonatas, received a Diapason d'Or. And of course, she recently released the CD Antonio Vandini Complete Works, a project in collaboration with Marc Vanscheeuwijck. Frey has been the recipient of a US-Italy Fulbright Fellowship, the SSHRC Canada Graduate Scholarship, American Musicological Society, and Canada Council for the Arts grants, facilitating her work on Italian cello music. She and the members of her quartet, Palla de Musica, were the grand prize winner of the 2012 Early Music America Baroque Performance Competition and second prize winners in the 2014 International Van Wassenaar Competition in Utrecht. And I'll note that Palla de Musica will be delivering a live stream performance for Music King and SSCM audiences on Thursday, so make sure not to miss that. Frey is currently a course instructor at McGill University and instructor of Baroque cello at the University of Montreal. She holds degrees from Mannes, McGill, and Juilliard, and is the visiting fellow in music from 2019 to 2022 at Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford University. In 2021, Frey was awarded Quebec's Opus Prize for Performer of the Year. Congratulations for that, Elinor. So before we begin, I just want to remind everyone that this is being live streamed. To minimize distractions, the chat function has been limited to host only. So please hold your questions until they are called for by the presenters. At that time, you're welcome to use the raise hand function or submit your name into the chat. So Marc and Elinor, I wonder if you would be willing to start us off by telling us a little bit about how this project began and a little bit about Vandini, who is a composer who's not so well known, often not known at all to today's audiences. Why Vandini? Why this project?
Marc, take it away.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Holly, and welcome everyone to this Rediscovering Antonio Vandini, a little conversation we'll have, and we'll share some of the experiences we had putting this all together. Now, why Vandini? Not because his last name starts with his same 3 letters as mine, but basically he's one of those many composers in the Baroque or galant style era that has been not very much in the center of attention, not only of cellists, but of music history in general. And since my doctoral work that dealt with composers who have sort of fallen off the bandwagon, I've sort of specialized ever since in looking at people that have been sort of discarded or forgotten. And Vandini is definitely one of these composers whom I got in touch with in terms of study and music, sort of by accident. It happened in 2006, I think, or 2005, when Paolo D'Acol, then librarian at the Conservatory in Trieste, organized a symposium on Giuseppe Tartini. And since there are actually two concertos that nobody really knew what instrument they were written for, because one of the concertos has no title page or indication of anything, and that's the autograph concerto. So it is written in tenor clef and nothing beyond that. And then another concerto that says Concerto per Viola. And that concerto had been either performed by gambists, which is a bit of an odd thing, because if the concerto is dated in the middle of the 18th century, the gamba in Padua, where this was written, was not exactly an instrument that was played at all anymore. And other people who played it were violists. And of course, that was a problem too, because written in tenor clef mostly, the concerto went far too low to be performed on a 4-foot tuned in C, G, D, A viola, as we have the viola today. So that sort of triggered my interest to get into that repertoire and to give a presentation at that conference. And then since my thesis there, my hypothesis was that these two concertos were actually written for cello, the question rose, of course, if played on a cello, who was the cellist for whom this might have been written, since both were written when Tartini was active in Padova. And of course, that brought me to Antonio Vandini, who was the first cellist at the Veneranda Arca of the Basilica del Santo, or Sant'Antonio, in Padova for a good half century of his career. So I thought, okay, well, let me look into this person. And then another conference came along in 2013, where at the Basilica del Santo, the research group of 17th and early 18th century scholars of the Amis in Como were organizing a conference around Franciscan musicians born in the 17th century. So I thought that was my chance, since Vandini was born on November 2nd, 1691. He's still fit within the 17th century, and he was a Franciscan friar. So that was absolutely perfect, working for the Basilica del Santo, which was obviously connected to a Franciscan monastery. So that's when I started digging into his music a little more in depth, and realized that the two modern editions of sonatas by Antonio Vandini, as I started to study them, realized that not one note of either one of these sonatas were actually by Antonio Vandini, because fortunately we have, between the libraries of the Nazionale Marciana in Venice, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, we actually have 6 sonatas plus one concerto that is in the library of Mecklenburg in Schwerin in Germany. So now all these pieces are on IMSLP, But back then I had to basically order them in manuscript or in photocopy or whatever it was. And so that got me into that. But at this point, let me share my screen because I have a few images I can show you before I hand it over to Elinor, who will then talk a little more about the project itself. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of a PowerPoint here. So the dates of Vandini, as you can see, is November 2nd, 1691, and he died on May 18th, 1778. So he had a long life of 87 years. And so Giuseppe Tartini was basically the concert master, if you want, of the Cappella Musicale at the Santo in Padua. The chapel master at that point was Antonio Vallotti, who is probably more famous for the tuning that he theorized, and that is too often, unfortunately, used for late 18th century music. But anyway, it's one of those tunings or temperaments, I would say, that has been used by a lot of harpsichordists today. And so, as I said, it is basically Tartini who invited Vandini to come and join him at the Santo, because Vandini was actually born in Bologna, and we have no idea with whom he studied. Some people have claimed that he studied with Giuseppe Iacchini, who was an important cellist in Bologna at that time, but there is no evidence for that. What we know is that he was a cellist in the important musical chapel at Santa Maria Maggiore in Bergamo, and that in 1720, in August 1720, Vivaldi invited him to join the group of teachers and performers at the Ospedale di Santa Maria della Pietà, where Vivaldi had been active since 1703, basically. So Vandini joined there, but as he was in Venice, he probably stopped in Padova, met Tartini, and Tartini invited him to join him in Padova, which he did as of June 1721, and then officially resigned from both Bergamo and from the Pietà in that same year. We don't even know whether Vandini ever met Vivaldi, because in that year in which Vandini was active at the Pietà, Vivaldi was actually in Rome and writing music there, and was away for a year and a half. So we don't even know whether they ever met. The reality is that Vandini arrived in Padova in 1721, but then was invited to go to Prague. Why? Because Charles VI, who was emperor already of the Holy Roman Empire, became king of Bohemia in 1723. And so the year before, Johann Joseph Fuchs was put in charge of organizing the festivities, and Fuchs invited all the best musicians he could find in Europe, including Domenico Scarlatti, harpsichordist, lute player, Silvio Leopold Weiss from Dresden. He had the castrati, especially Caffarelli was there too, and invited Tartini and Vandini. Actually, he had invited Vandini. He didn't quite know about Tartini, which is interesting. So he invited Vandini to Prague, and Vandini, having arrived in Prague, wrote a letter to his friend Tartini and said, "Come and join me. This is a party here." And so we all know what happened with the musical festivities then in 1723, probably one of the most pan-European musical celebrations in the early 18th century. But the result of all that is that Vandini and Tartini got hired by Count Ferdinand Franz Kinsky to work at his court, at his palace in Prague. And basically they stayed there for another 3 years after the festivities. So they only got back to Padua in 1726. And that's the church where they worked, the Santo, which is, as you can see, has the domes, a little bit like St. Mark in Venice. It's also an 11th, 12th century church. And the inside here in the center is the choir, where basically the music was happening. So these two concertos I was mentioning, one by, the first by Tartini says concerto per viola con quartetto e due corni accompagnanti. And that is interesting because it is preserved in Vienna in the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde, and it's an autograph, but it was first published as a concerto for viola da gamba by Friedrich Grützmacher, who was an important cello pedagogue. And so as a concerto for viola da gamba, it was not touched by any cellists, whereas the other concerto that has no title page in the manuscript in Padova doesn't say anything. So, and that is another autograph that has been preserved in Padova in the Biblioteca Antoniana. As you can see here, the manuscript, nothing says anything. You just start with the score, Allegro assai here, and there is nothing that mentions even any instruments. You have to figure it out from the clefs. So violists had been playing the concerto. Pierluigi Petrobelli, the musicologist from Rome, had written an article in 1968 on the fact that it was most probably for viola da gamba. But if we look at the concerto, there are a few things in there, a few double stops, a few cadential moments where you realize this cannot have been written for a viola da gamba. And being in bass and especially in tenor clef, it was meant for an instrument. So this is the sonata I was mentioning that was published by Schott in 1911 here in the Russian edition. But this music is not by Vandini at all. So, and then we have a few pictures which are interesting because Vandini was here caricatured by Pierluigi Ghezzi in Rome when he visited in 1750. And the interesting part is that he holds the bow in the underhand position as sort of gambists have been done. And that has been confirmed by a few music historians, especially Charles Burney, as you can see here, talking about his visit in Padova. At the end here, he says, it's remarkable that Antonio and all the other violoncello players here hold the bow in the old-fashioned way with the hand under it. And here in another source from 1790 from Christoph von Moor, who talks about basically it's the publication is a Verzeichnis der besten Tonkünstler, or sort of a collection of the best composers. And here on about the cello in Padova, he says, der berühmte Antonio Vandini, he says, hält den Bogen nach den alter Art. So he holds the bow in the old fashion, mit der Hand am Haare, with the hand on the hair, and the thumb on the wood, wie bei dem Gambenspielen, just like the gamba players do. So when I started looking at this music, first of all, playing those sonatas was far too difficult for me. I needed a cellist who had the technique to play that, because apart from a couple of sonatas, this really requires seriously advanced technique, almost in the sense of Boccherini, thumb technique development, and so forth. And then the other thing is that since all this music had been written by a cellist who played with underhand bowing, I had to find, a cellist who could have the left hand virtuosity that was needed for that, plus somebody who would be willing to get completely out of their comfort zone and to acquire underhand bowing technique, not exactly like gambists, but more like double bass players. So that's when the project was pretty much born to collaborate with Elinor, whom I had known for quite a few years already, and who was one of the very, very few cellists I knew who had the chops to do that, and who was also, going along with a lot of the research I had done about the cello in the Baroque period, which was not necessarily one size instrument, but instruments with 4 strings, with 5 strings, smaller sizes, larger sizes, played overhand bowing, underhand bowing, and so forth and so on. So we decided to embark on a project that was, first of all, meant to be a recording, but acquiring all that technique took some time, and then we wanted to play a few concerts, which ended up happening. We did a concert in Montreal a few years ago, and then a tour in Trieste before we actually got into the recording. But since we had to look at the music really carefully, we also decided to do an edition. But I will pass it on to Elinor at this point because I have talked enough already.
More concerts to come. We'll do more. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
I'll stop sharing my screen so you can.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me and Marc here. This has been a really wonderful project, and we started talking about it in around 2017, early on in the year, and then we spent the bulk of the work at the end of 2017. Projects take a long time if you're really serious about them, and I devoted 2 months of coming to Italy, where I would meet with Marc. I think we met 3 times or something to just talk about the music, talk about the project, work on it, go back to our respective corners, do more, and then come back again. And I think that process was really great because we met and we also worked on our own. And I was just really happy that Marc, included me in this big exploration. And it did mean that I had to learn a whole new technique. And that was partly why I spent the 2 months where I only played that technique. And to not just dabble and try it out here and there, but, really build a new kind of brain pathway and figure out how to get into the nuance. Because there's a long period of being able to kind of do it, but not at the very refined level. And I want to also share a PowerPoint that I made as well, but I just want to add a little bit to this biography that the discussion of terminology is a very long discussion that has happened with many people. But I wanted to also add that at the end of Tartini's life, he lived in Vandini's house, and they were extremely close. And Tartini died, and Vandini sort of wrote his first biography, a very mini short biography. And in that brief document, he calls himself, Vandini himself, he calls himself a professor of viola. And so obviously, this term viola applied to himself as well as violoncello and the other things. So, and that's just another proof that this concerto for viola is probably for Vandini. So I don't know if Marc wants to add to that
just very briefly, viola is the standard term in the Veneto in the 17th and 18th century to indicate the bass of the violin family, because the small viola is the violino, and that's the violin, the treble. The second to the smallest one is the violetta, which is the alto of the family. Mm-hmm. And then for the bigger instruments, they go to violone in the 18th century, which is a 12-foot or a 16-foot instrument. So viola is actually the bass instrument. And it's the same thing in Naples. And there are several regions like that in Italy, but mainly the Veneto and Naples, where viola is the standard term for the bass instrument of the violin family. If they refer to the viola da gamba, they add da gamba always.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so can you all see my... Okay, looks good. Okay.
Yes.
So a little bit, I love to say a little bit about how projects come about. So this project obviously is a collaboration with Marc, and I also worked a lot with the gambist and bass player Pachi Montero, talking about bow holds And one time, Marc, Patchy, and we all got together and talked as well. And because this was a new technique that I hadn't been playing my whole life since the age of 8, I wanted to really think it through. So the project, of course, for me, and I think also a lot for Marc, is about learning and exploring, and we changed ideas over the course of the years. It's also someone that I really trust, and that because I trust him, I'm willing to be vulnerable to, learning something different and new, and know that he'll work with me to the end and be patient, and that he trusts me to do a good job in the final result. And so that was really great. So I was all in for this project. And I think also we're both really reliable. If we say we're going to do it, we're really going to do it, and have a high standard of excellence. And then also there was a big part of this was fundraising and planning, to make sure that we could pay for the whole thing and plan really well to make it happen. So that's why, it took about 4 years to complete. And then the project was also about the bow hold and bow technique, which you heard about already, and left-hand explorations, especially this exploration of crossing over the strings rather than shifting up and down, which is a more typical technique now for cello playing. A lot of big shifting is standard for playing, and Vandini's music really explores a different approach to left-hand technique. Then, of course, the project involved performing and recording and making the critical edition. So Marc already showed you this picture, but there's also another Getzy sketch, and they both show him playing underhand. That was the starting point of, okay, it's for sure underhand, but then we weren't really exactly sure what total bow position would be correct. So does that mean that you touch the hair, or that you have 2 fingers on the stick, or is it like this picture? It seems like a lot of fingers are on the hair. How far back on the frog would you play? Or, the gambists these days mostly play farther up, really not touching the frog. So we discussed all these. We, like I said, we went back to our own corners and tried different things, and then came back and said, this bow hold looks like this picture. And, just trying everything first, rather than having a preconceived idea about what this project is and should be. And yeah, so there are lots of pictures, and some of them have slight differences. I just wanted to show you that this has a straight nose and that has a very crooked nose. So there's some variety out there floating around. And we looked at iconography. Now, these are just 2 pictures, but there are dozens and dozens of pictures of underhand bow holds that we looked at and tried to understand if there were regional differences of decade. These are just examples of the kind of things that, seeing this bow hold, we'd try it out and explore whether there was any relation to Vandini and his music and his time. So this is a kind of little picture timeline of my bow exploration. And actually, this is at Marc's house. He recognizes his floor, I'm sure, in Italy. And this is one of Marc's bows. And we were trying a bow hold where you kind of hook the second finger around the frog. So that was one day we did that. And this is a bow from Patchy Montero, who I mentioned before. And also trying, but with more fingers, touching the frog, with the hand really at the end, around the end of the frog. So, just a couple different explorations. And then I didn't own a bow that I felt was appropriate for this music. So I had some kind of funny steps where I tried to turn my bow into a bow with a bigger frog. So you can see I stuffed some thick cardboard into the frog. And to be honest, I practiced with that for weeks. It was not very glamorous, but it did the job. It got me farther along because I didn't own a bow, and nobody in the bow makers weren't selling these things. It was really amazing how quickly things change. Right now, many bow makers say, oh, I make an underhand cello bow. But just in 2017, it seemed like something only Marc and I were doing. Maybe some other people were, but I didn't really know many people thinking in this way. And then a wood-making friend of mine made me an extension with wood that I put in. It did the same thing as the paper. So if you, as a cellist, want to try this out, be careful. You have to loosen your hair, and you don't want to hurt your bow. But you could just stick some thick paper and just see what that's like. Then I went and I met with bow maker Antonino Arenti, who's in Genova, and this was the first model that we made. We were trying to copy Tartini's bow that's in the Trieste library, and it's a very long bow with not much camber, pretty straight, but not arched either. And this bow was rejected. It didn't really work. So it had a very large frog, but in the whole middle part, when I tried to play it, it kind of bobbled and blah, 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 and it didn't have much control. And it just was kind of a fail, like experimentation. So then this one up here is the beta, the second try, using a model that was a little bit earlier, and which kind of makes sense. Somebody who grew up in Bologna, maybe this model worked better for Vandini's music rather than trying to go towards the Tartini violin bow. So that was an exploration of what did the bow shape like, what would work for the music. And so that's what I have here today. And since then, the bowmaker has told me that he's refined his model and he thinks he has even better mix now. But that was where we're at, and it works for me. It worked great for the recording, so I don't plan on getting another bow yet. Although there might, in the future be another underhand bow for me. And then the last thing I talk about, I have more to say, but I'm going to turn it back over to Marc. I want to talk about the fingering side. Hopefully you can all see this, but this is the second movement of his E major cello sonata. And you can see there's a little circle right away at the beginning of the manuscript, except for it's not above the note, which typically in cello music, if you're going to give a fingering, like first finger or thumb, it would be above the note that you're supposed to play on. So this is a different system, which I personally haven't seen other composers do. And basically he's circling the spot in which your thumb should go, and he tells you in advance, and then you play whatever finger you need for that note that's next, but as long as your thumb's on. So your thumb's on F, and you're going to start the piece on E, which is going to be your third finger. So, and then when you have to shift and change, you can see there's one there. There's also one here. It's just right before the note. In this case, it's the same note as the next note, but in this case, the thumb is shown on a note a lot lower than the next note in the piece. So you can see there's here, similar case, it's a different note. And anyways, there's many examples. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. So let's listen to this second movement of E major sonata. And what I think you can hear is that by having all this thumb position, there's a darker color, and a lot of the phrases stay in one color. Okay, so let's hear this. So you also probably noticed that it's mostly written in treble clef, but you read it an octave down. That's very typical of the time. So I'm going to stop there and talk about the rest of what I wanted to say after we hear again from Marc. So take it away, Marc.
I'll unmute myself. Yeah, it's actually quite interesting to have in the manuscripts from Berlin. So I said there are 3 manuscripts from Berlin. We've also tried to date the 6 sonatas based on the style a little bit, which is, always a little bit of guessing. And so we tried to give the complete works of Vandini, because all we have by Vandini are those 6 sonatas and the concerto. So that's what we put on the CD. But the sonatas in Berlin, which are not autograph, we don't have any autographs by Vandini, are interesting because they have those fingerings, and especially fingerings that are, for the upper positions, quite different from what we do on modern cello. So that too takes, the player, in this case, Elinor, quite far out of her comfort zone. And it's always a risk to get into that, because, of course, you never sound at your best when you have done things for 30 years in a certain way, and then you change to something completely different, in 1 or 2 years before a recording. But I think that's exactly what we need to do as true Baroque cellists, is just the virtuosity of the Baroque cellist includes playing 3, 4, 5 different size instruments with different tunings, with different numbers of strings, with different ways of bowing the instrument. And so basically, this is part of the vocabulary of the Baroque cellist, is to be able to do all these different things. Once the cello gets standardized, starting in some areas, especially Paris in the 1740s, then we get pretty much the instrument that we know today, and it is sort of an ideal compromise between the smaller Baroque violoncello and the larger Baroque violone, which were tuned the same way, but were different sizes of instruments and were used for different purposes. The smaller ones for solo music, the larger ones for orchestral music, or for playing continuo in smaller ensembles. Once that instrument got standardized into sort of one size fits all, then we see that the virtuosity in terms of playing very fast and going all the way up and down the fingerboard starts to develop a lot. So it's a different kind of virtuosity that develops starting in the second half of the 18th century. And Vandini is interesting because he's right in the middle. He still plays a smaller instrument, which in Padova he often called, instead of viola, which was a normal term, he's also mentioned in the archives as sonador de violotto. And violotto is sort of a, some people have thought maybe it was a viola pomposa, which is a bit absurd because that term, occurs much later than we have violotto in the sources. But it's basically an augmentative of viola. So maybe it's a reference to something that looks a little more like a classical cello as we know it today. But what it seems like from the few pictures that Elinor has shown too is that Vandini probably played a fairly small instrument, which makes the kinds of fingerings that appear in the score a lot more feasible too. Now, as I said, these are not autographs, and we don't know if those fingerings are Vandini's, but the manuscripts, both the music and the fingerings, are by the same hand, and it looks like a late 18th century hand. It's also reflecting other cellists like Graziani, who was a cellist at the court in Berlin before Jean-Louis Duport arrived there. And, Duport is the one who played the Beethoven sonatas with Beethoven in 1795. So we're in that same period between the 1780s and the 1790s, where we see in the manuscripts of Graziani that we have that same kind of approach to fingering, which is very different from the modern one, but is also similar to Boccherini's, where you place your hand in a position that is often indicated by the clef itself, and then you stay there. And Boccherini was such a a virtuoso who was fascinated with tone color, with timbre, that he often played things that could have been played very easily in first position on the highest string. He went to thumb position on the lowest string just to have that kind of dark tone color. So we really thought that these fingerings, combined with the other type of bow, were actually capable of bringing a completely new timbre to the music and to that instrument. So that's what we wanted to reflect in the edition itself. The manuscripts are quite clear, as you have seen. Not all of them. The Venetian one is a bit, complicated to read, but the Berlin ones are fine. The Paris ones, the two sonatas from Paris, are okay to read. But we thought an edition would be a good idea also to bring the music into context. And, we thought about many options, many possible editors, the more scholarly ones that unfortunately are very expensive and only to be found in libraries if those libraries still have the funds to buy those collections. So we decided to go with Musedita in Italy, which is very fast. The editor is also a friend, which helps. And the thing is, those editions, we can really do what we want in terms of quality, in terms of critical apparatus, in terms of introduction, even in terms of the formatting of the music. And the good news is that each one of these scores, rarely costs more than 15 euros, which makes it affordable to everyone. And since this music, we wanted this music to be played because it's actually fun music. And we wanted to do the whole edition, but unfortunately, Musedita had already published the cello concerto, so we only did the 6 sonatas. But at least every cellist can afford to actually play that music because the score is so cheap. So I'll stop here because I would still like to leave some time for questions if anyone has any, but I'll pass it back on to Elinor, who can talk a little more in detail about the edition.
Yeah, I'll just finish up my little PowerPoint and show some of what we did. Are you all seeing this again? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, fabulous. So the edition had a couple steps. The first step is typesetting. You always need 2 eyes, someone to make the actual part and then someone to check it. And that's my role, is to check. So I didn't want to make the typesetting and then have someone else check it. So that was done by a colleague of mine here in Montreal. And then we made the critical notes, which is carefully keeping track of when we made any change. And that was also something we did when we met in 2017, as we discussed, this harmony is a little funny, should we change that? Or this bowing isn't clear, should we just change that? And, anything that we changed was tracked in our critical notes. And Marc made the introduction, and then we had to choose our editor and distributor, and Marc already talked about that. So this is Marc's introduction, and that then was sort of shortened a little and changed a little bit of the style of writing for the introductory notes for our CD. And but he'll probably say that the ideas are basically the same. It's just longer and more elaborate in the edition. And here's an example of the critical notes where you just see the bar numbers and any changes, corrections from the manuscript into our version. And then here, the last page that you see, this comes from another of the Berlin pieces of the Sonata in B flat, and there's a lot of those little thumb position, a lot of fingerings. And actually, that was a funny story. When we sent the first version that we had prepared to the editor, he changed all my thumb positions and put them above the note, which is the typical way now, thinking they should be above the note, and I had just made an error, and I had to go and carefully correct everyone and tell him to put it back, and then check that had been put back in the right spot. So that added hours of unanticipated work. So these things always take a lot longer and a lot more effort than you ever dream, but then it's a lot of fun to feel it and have it in your hand and hold it in your hand when it's all done. And as I mentioned, the notes. Marc also wrote the liner notes for the CD, and some of the fun parts of our research, like there's a letter about Tartini and Vandini that's now the cover of the booklet of the CD, and Marc mentions them in the notes. So I think that's a lot of fun for us to have all these details, pictures, notes. There's just a lot of stuff that goes into the CD that makes it come alive. And then we were very careful, had a long talk about planning the instrumentation of the CD. There's 7 pieces. And for the ones that are in Paris, we had the continuo of harpsichord and gamba along with the cello, because in that same manuscript collection that the Vandini Paris sonatas are in, there are some pieces for gamba, and we felt there was a kind of proximity of the 2 instruments, and we took advantage of that idea and just enjoyed that by adding the gamba for those 2. And then for the 2 sonatas in C major, one from Venice and one from Berlin, Marc played cello for the continuo along with harpsichord, and he of course played underhand as well. And one time he played on his bigger cello and one time on his smaller cello, so there's a lot of variety even within that. And then for the 2 sonatas that are just crazy hard, we just had harpsichord as continuo, just clean it up and give the soloist space to not worry about anything, just have one continuo player. So that was kind of the reason for that. And here's the cover of the CD, which is Vandini, of course. And then, as Marc mentioned, we had a great fortune to perform in Trieste. So I'm going to play a little excerpt of the concert that we played together. And you'll see, hopefully you can see Marc's playing underhand, Patchy's playing underhand, I'm playing underhand. And this is just the opening of the concerto. So we have 2 violins and a viola as well. Oops. Okay, I'll stop there, and then you can hear a tiny bit of the same piece, but from the CD version. Oops.
I'm Elinor Frey.
Well, you can all go on YouTube and watch the whole thing. It's a little introduction to our CD, and I kind of zoomed through that so we have time for questions. So I hope that gives a little more idea about the publishing and the project. Marc, do you want to add anything to that from what I started saying?
Yeah. No, I think we can open it to questions if
Yeah.
It looks like we only have 10 minutes. We still have plenty to say, but that's all.
Yeah. Yeah.
If there are any questions, either through YouTube or in the small group that is here on Zoom with us.
Well, I know I have a question to get it started while everyone's gathering their thoughts, and I'll invite people who are watching on YouTube too. If you'd like to use the chat feature, we'll definitely convey your questions over to Marc and Elinor. Elinor, you mentioned that as you and Marc were creating this edition, some choices that had to be made, editorial choices. And I wonder what exactly went into that thought process, because I imagine that you encountered some things that are specifically made to work for this underhand bow technique that might not transfer so well to an overhand technique. And so, what kind of audience did you have in mind? Did you, what should people who are coming to this with an overhand technique, do they have to change to underhand? How did you make those decisions?
I actually think that his music sounds great overhand. I played a few of the sonatas on the recording overhand because I think the spirit of what I have learned from Marc after all these years of enjoying his mentoring is to explore and to have variety, and as he said, that the virtuosity is in the flexibility and not to be fixed. And I don't feel like I need to make some big statement like this belongs underhand and it's only good underhand, and and nobody should touch it unless they do what I did and learn underhand. And I don't feel like that at all. I think if I've been practicing underhand and I'm feeling good about it, I'm going to try and play a concert with it underhand. And maybe there's a time where I want to play the piece and I don't play underhand, and I enjoy that too. And the music works perfectly well overhand. It sounds great. And when you play underhand, yeah, there is a change. There's something that comes out of it that feels natural to the music. There's a connection between the string and your hand. There's a kind of articulation that's very natural to underhand, as well as a legato sound. And especially the sonata in C major from Berlin that Marc and I played together a lot. It sounds to me like an opera aria. It's just like a singer. And it just is so natural to connect and to articulate at the same time with the underhand bow. But I don't think there's anything in the actual music that demands necessarily underhand. Maybe Marc feels differently, but...
No, well, it's in the case of Vandini, since he's sort of, a late bloomer in this older technique, what underhand bowing has brought to me is a different kind of sound and articulation, a sound that has more core, because your arm, actually the weight of the arm is different. You're not holding up the bow and putting it on the string. It's actually on the string already. And the other thing is that you have a lot more variety in the type of attack you can give. So you get, what it has given me is a lot more different consonances in the, a lot more, consonants, not consonances, but consonants instead of vowels. We're so trained to play open vowels to get this kind of sort of bel canto 19th century style. And then we have a very limited array of consonants and ways to start the note. You can really think of a P or a T or an M or a V or anything like that when you play underhand. So for earlier musics, when we know that, the standard way of playing cello was underhand in the entire 17th century and for the first quarter of the 18th century, except a few exceptions, and these were mainly 18th century Neapolitan players who were first of all violinists and played all the instruments of the violin family. And then they exported that to Paris once, a lot of Neapolitan musicians left in the early 18th century. And that is what the first cello methods have picked up on in the 1740s to play that underhand. But they announce it as some kind of a manifesto of a new approach to the cello. So for all the older music, it makes more sense to play underhand. With Vandini, you can go both ways, because also I think since those manuscripts in Berlin are not autograph and the fingerings are probably not Vandini's at all, they most probably were used by people who played overhand, even though in Berlin they kept underhand longer with people like Abel, who was also a gambist, and Graun and so forth, and who worked on that repertoire too. But again, as Elinor was saying too, it's a question of variety, and you can really get to completely different types of sounds if you work with both ways of using the bow.
And Bernie's great compliment to Vandini was that he played a parlare with a speaking quality. And so I think this speaking style but is also quite connected. And it's like both at once. It's not one or the other, super legato or super choppy. It has this great unity. And so the only thing that I try not to do is play in the kind of monumental style where I'm pumping out the sound from the cello in a sort of, sorry, but macho, monumental way. I'm not so interested in that. So, sometimes it might be a little strange at first to hear a cello soloist and not be blasted with my soloistic sound. I'm mostly just fitting into the ensemble, speaking quality, articulating, but singing through the sound as well. And those are my goals with playing this music.
And there is no need for that. It doesn't work with underhand. And second, we also know that the vast majority of the concerto instrumentations were exactly what we did. That means one on a part. So when you have two violins, a viola, another cello, a bass, a harpsichord, and maybe in some cases a theorbo, there's no need to blast out sound, when you play the solo part. It is already high enough in the register that it shines by itself, so you don't have to push it, and then you can enjoy the beauty of those gut strings too, which helps in that suonare a parlare, as Bernie was saying about Vandini, who really played rhetorically and played like he was telling a story rather than forcing something on the listeners.
Thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions from the YouTube, actually. The first one is, I'd like to ask, would a cellist in that time be used to switching between overhand and underhand technique, or just stick with one for cello?
Good question, because it depends when. In the 17th century, basically everyone played underhand and didn't switch. In Naples, violinists played viola, played cello. In the conservatories, kids played the violin family instruments. But we have plenty of examples of people, even in Germany, the Stadtpfeifer or the Kunstpfeifer, who would play both violin overhand and viola da gamba underhand. Mm-hmm. So, they could go either way and mix the two, but that's more an 18th century phenomenon, I think. But we definitely have a few examples of cellists who went both ways and would play underhand. Quantz, for instance, in his treatise, mentions that every good cellist should have two instruments, a small one and a large one, and the small one with a light bow and white hair on the bow, whereas the large one would have to have bigger, thicker strings and a heavier bow and black hair. And so he doesn't talk about the bow hold, but given those different instruments and different bows, most typically the solo small instrument would have been played overhand, whereas the larger violone type cello would probably have been played underhand. And since almost all professional instrumentalists in the Baroque period were multi-instrumentalists, they were used to switch around from oboe to harpsichord to violin to cello to horn to, played it virtually all.
Yeah, and for me, I mean, I'm very interested in early music. It's so fascinating, and I think it's essential to do the research and to learn and to try all these things. But I completely love and accept that we're here in 2021 and we have different demands on our being a cellist in our life. And right now, to be a Baroque cellist means to switch back and forth or to have many instruments. It's different than what someone, say Vandini or someone in the 1740s had to do in their life, but they also didn't have computers and quick access to lots of information, and it's just a whole different world. And so, now we're expected to have hundreds and hundreds of years of repertoire, and that's okay. We're here now. We can't really go back. So what we have to do now is different than what they had to do then. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for this. I really appreciated you talking about, especially the vulnerability that you opened yourself up for as experimenters with this new process, new techniques, and even new, changing your bow, when you didn't have the equipment that you needed at the time was really, really great to know that we can all open ourselves up to do that and to try new things. And I know Marc is going to talk about that more during his keynote presentation tomorrow. So thank you both for being here. I see that we are out of time. I want to remind our audience that's watching that Elinor will be back with Palla de Musica on Thursday evening for a fantastic concert there. So thank you both so very much, and we look forward to hearing more from both of you in the coming days.
Thank you.
Thanks, Holly.
Thanks, Elinor.
Thanks, Marc.
Thanks,